Welcome everyone at our first HR Bite-Sized information session delivered by Elissa Thursfield, who is Director of both Gamblins Law and HR Anchor. Today she will be talking about managing remote staff, and I think we only have half an hour, so it's over to you, Elissa.
Thanks, Vanessa. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on managing a remote workforce. There's quite a lot for us to get through, so I'm just going to say welcome, everybody, and we're going to get cracking as quickly as possible. So I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the slides coming up there as well. Now, we are recording the session, so if you're aware that the session's been going on, or you'd like to download the session, keep it, come back for further reference, then please feel free. We'll probably also get it up on YouTube as well. So, as Vanessa has said, my name is Elissa Thursfield. I'm Head of Employment at Gamblins Law and a Director at the law firm, and I'm also a Director of HR Anchor, which is a full-service HR firm, so providing support for businesses at times of HR need, particularly during a time like this when there's so much of a HR need during the coronavirus crisis. So what are we talking about today when we're talking about managing remote staff? So we're going to be talking about the practical issues of actually managing staff, management methods, employee concerns and welfare, and how to keep your team together when you're working on a remote basis, possibly spread out all over the country. And then we'll have some questions if we've got some time at the end. So we're in the new working world at the moment. We saw a shocking statistic really this week from Direct Line, who've done a survey, and apparently 13 million people, once this crisis has settled, are going to be requesting permanent changes to their working arrangements. The reason being, remote working has become so much more the norm. COVID-19 has thrust remote working into the immediate necessity for very businesses, and there was very little warning of this to allow employers to prepare. So COVID-19, yes, it was it's an issue in China, it's starting to become an issue around the world, but I don't think many businesses actually had any idea how this crisis was going to affect the working environment, and that almost overnight they would have huge portions of their workforce either on furlough, which was a completely foreign concept, or indeed working from home and working on a remote basis. Now, for smaller businesses, they've had difficulty with resources, and particularly where things like laptops are shared, and perhaps they haven't got the necessary equipment to allow people to work from home, and certainly older, more traditional businesses which have had difficulty historically with change, they have also had some significant challenges during this big shift towards remote working. And what's been a big focus particularly for lots of our clients is the importance of trust in that employment relationship. During times of remote working, you are relying very much on being able to trust your employees, and equally for your employees to know that you trust them and that you're not going to be micromanaging them or overdoing it on monitoring and things like that. So how do we propose that remote working should be set out? Now, the reality is that, remote working's been going on for several weeks for you already. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's too late to set some ground rules if you haven't done so already. You might have been going through a period of just sort of managing, making do, and now would be a really good time to sort of take stock and see how you can improve those practices and get the most out of your workforce whilst they're working remotely. So setting some ground rules, really key one for me. Make sure they're getting dressed in the morning. Now, I don't mean logging onto a webcam and watching anything inappropriate. What I'm saying is you should say to your staff members, you should dress as if you are coming to the office. Doesn't need to be over the top. So for example, I always make sure that I've got shoes on. A big thing about wearing shoes, I don't feel like I sort of sat on the sofa or anything like that, and a shirt, blouse, or something appropriate for work, particularly because you don't necessarily know if you're going to be needed on a short notice video call or anything like that. So get dressed, look the part, still feel like you're at work. Morning to-do list and afternoon review. So this is a really good tool of making sure that people still have structure to their day. So you can ask them in the morning perhaps to send over a to-do list of what they're planning to achieve in that day, and then also in the afternoon ask them to review what they've done, what their progress is, and what they've achieved for the day. Now, these don't need to be lengthy lists. It doesn't need to be lots of detail. You don't want to be massively adding to somebody's work list, but what this should reflect is probably what you would do in the office in good practice in any event. So checking in with your staff to see what they've been doing through the day and what they've achieved. You should set down what your expected response and turnaround times are. So if you set a task for a staff member who's working remotely, make sure they're aware of what that turnaround time should be so that they can manage their day appropriately. Have a think about background. So for videos, as you'll see, mine's branded up today, which is something that we do for when we're delivering remote sessions. Equally, when you're having team meetings, do you want to be looking in the inside of their house, or do you expect them to have something a bit more neutral and less distracting in the background? If they can work somewhere where it's not particularly cluttered in the background, or there's a blank wall, obviously that's better, because things can certainly draw the eye. Now, what I'd say with this is you need to have some element of flexibility, particularly, with people working from home. They may have small children around, there may be pets in the background and background noise, and that's just something that you need to have an element of tolerance to. And it happens to the best of us. So, for example, I was on a preliminary hearing with a judge 2 or 3 weeks ago, and my dog started barking towards the end of the session. The judge took it with great humour and actually gave me an example of an instance where a solicitor had been delivering submissions and her child walked onto the video and asked her what time lunch was. So having that patience and having a bit of sense of humour with it, but obviously if it becomes a bit of a persistent issue, that's something you're going to have to address with the employee to make sure that actually their day is not becoming too distracting and that they are actually able to work when they're at home. Making sure that when you do video calls that people actually put their video on as well. That face-to-face time with staff is really important. You're going to be missing out on lots of face-to-face time with your employees. And whilst people might feel a bit awkward at first, and people feel they look a bit different on video calls, it can certainly feel very in your face as well. So depending on the program I'm using, you never know if you're actually too close to the camera, too far away. So it's making sure that people get in the habit of turning that video on so that there is that face-to-face time. Have a think about data protection and confidentiality as well. With people working from home, are they going to have confidential documentation spread out all over their desk? Is this an opportunity to look at paperless working, so things are more secure on their computer? And making sure that people are, still keeping good practice in terms of password protecting their computers, not leaving screens on and things like that. Just purely, again, for good practice, you don't want to be in a situation where you're having confidentiality breaches that you're not even aware of when you would have had much more of a level of control in the workplace. So management methods. So the SMART method is, it's quite a traditional management method, but it's something that can work very effectively when you're managing remote staff as well. So manage SMART, you want to look at specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time. So specific, fully describe the desired outcome that you need from somebody. Lots of breakdowns in management relationships, particularly between, where you've got a management and then the people that they're managing, is where actually they're not being very specific with their instructions and people don't actually know what's expected of them. They deliver something that the manager wasn't expecting, and often it doesn't lead to a great outcome, and sometimes even capability proceedings or breakdowns in relationships. So make sure you're specific about what it is that you want from the employee and describe what it is that you want to be accomplished. Make sure it's measurable. So make sure the goal can be quantifiable and measurable in some way. You don't want it to be too vague. Make sure it's something that an employee actually knows if they've been able to achieve it or not. So attainable, you want to stretch your staff, but make sure that they have achievable goals. So discuss the ultimate goal. Do they need any resources? Is there any support that's needed? Have you set your expectations far too high? Now, the issue with remote working is, again, because you've got that distance from your staff members, you're not hands-on, you're not on the ground with them, you're not having lots of face-to-face time, is making sure that the goals you're setting them are still attainable, that you're not losing touch with the skills base that your staff have. Relevant, so make sure what you're setting them is relevant to the team's objectives. This is important as well because it makes remote team members feel much more part of a cohesive team. If they don't sort of see the point of what they're doing, it doesn't seem particularly relevant to a team's goals or objectives, again, you can lose a bit of that crucial employee engagement. And time, make sure that everybody is aware of the time frame for achieving that goal. Again, if you're reading, if you're reading off different hymn sheets here, then it can be a bit of an issue again. So if somebody isn't expecting to return something till the following week, but you want it back this week, again, that's going to create relationship issues. So smart working method, it's really good for a cohesive working environment, even when you're working remotely. So some practical management tips. So set the contact parameters. So how often do you expect people to keep in touch and by what method? Now this might not necessarily be how often you want your employees to call you. It might well be, look, I'm going to get in touch with you a couple of times a day. So make sure that they are aware of that and by what method you're going to expect to do that. There's nothing worse than expecting a phone call and all of a sudden a video request pops up. So if you're going to consistently do it by video, make sure they're aware of that. Make sure that there is a social element to daily and weekly calls. So if you are going to be calling an employee several times a day, there's a lot of work pressure on people when they're working from home. Make sure you are having a bit of a social chat with them, a bit of a check-in, obviously keeping things appropriate and within work boundaries, but making sure that employees are feeling valued and that you're interested in them personally to an extent as well. As we've already said, video on, and have a look and see what time is that email being sent. Is it being sent really late at night? Is something coming in really early in the morning? Does it appear that someone's not taking a lunch hour? So be really proactive in terms of looking for those sort of early warning signs that someone's not getting enough of a balance. Because realistically, if they were in an office and you noticed that they were staying in the office till 10, 11, midnight, you'd probably be having something to say about it if that behavior was a bit unusual. So there's no reason for remote working for that to be any different. Agree how you'll update the whole team. Agree how you will update your team, not just how they're going to update you. So, as managers, we often expect regular updates from our staff and how they're getting on, but perhaps you could be updating your team as well of how things are going as a team, any company updates that you're able to release and things like that. So make sure that it's a two-way communication stream. Try not to micromanage. Now, this is something that lots of managers do fall foul of when that shift to remote working is made. And this comes down to trust again. So, if you micromanage your employees, if you're watching every little tiny step that they're making, if you're expecting feedback for tiny little steps in a larger project, employees don't feel trusted, they feel undermined, and it creates a very oppressive environment to be working in, even when they're working from home. And it can really start to affect people's work-life balance if they feel that they're being micromanaged and need to prove themselves when actually it's not strictly necessary. So take a step back. If you are getting too involved, perhaps have a chat with one of your peers, another manager, and just sort of try and scale that back if you are starting to micromanage. And you can take some feedback from the people you're managing as well and see how they feel about the level of supervision that they're having. Tell employees when you'll give feedback. So don't leave them unsure and anxiously waiting or feeling unable to leave their computer. So if you set them a task, again, make sure that they are aware when that needs to be returned. If you say to them, I'll come back to you on this in a few minutes, someone's likely to sit by their computer and wait. So if it's at 5 o'clock and you say to them, right, I'll get back to you on this in a minute, just hang fire. You don't want someone sitting by their computer all night waiting for you when you've forgotten. So be very clear on when you're going to feedback. If you said you're going to feedback on something, make sure you do it at the time you have done. And if you haven't got time, again, let them know that parameter has changed. Now, employee welfare. So again, if someone's working and you're face-to-face and you're in the office all together, it can be easier to spot employee welfare issues. Now, remote working presents a whole load of new issues that weren't necessarily as much of an issue before. So as we've already discussed, consider their hours of work. Are they working long hours to accommodate perhaps a disruptive home life? Is actually home working manageable for them? Are they trying to homeschool their kids and cook dinner and put washing on and trying to work in between, and so working into the night to make up time? That's not really an acceptable working pattern if it's not being effective. So perhaps you need to have a chat about people's routines and make sure that you check in on that every few weeks as well, so that they're not slipping into bad habits. Now, that's not saying that they can't look after their kids during the day or put a wash on, but it's making sure that one, the work doesn't suffer, and two, that their work-life balance doesn't suffer either by them working too late into the night or working early to accommodate for that time they're losing during the day. You also need to ensure they're taking regular breaks. Without the chance to interact in the office, often people do end up sort of sitting at the computer, they look up and it's the end of the day, and where's the day gone and where have all the hours gone, and they've hardly moved from their desk. So you need to encourage people to take regular breaks, even if they go and have a walk around their garden, get some fresh air, and make sure that their day and screen time is being broken up. Now, lack of water cooler moments. Now, what I mean by this is if you're in an office, you know, you go and get a drink, you go to the canteen, there's the chance to sort of chat and interact with your colleagues. Now, that is something that's really missing with remote working. And actually, it's quite crucial to people's welfare at work, the relationships that they build. And moving on to the next point, it means relationships can suffer as well. So have a think about a mechanism to, you know, encourage interaction between staff members. I've got a couple of suggestions that we'll come on to later on, but making sure that staff feel free to be able to have those social interactions together and talk about things that aren't necessarily work related, or indeed can collaborate in the way that they perhaps would in an informal way at work, and finding a way of doing that with remote working. Now, stress is, again, so people often think, oh, you work from home, it must be a much less stressful environment. Often it isn't. So if someone is at home, they've got the pressures of home life that can be magnified, plus then they've got all their work to do. Video calls, they can feel very under pressure with those, and often employees feel the need to prove themselves and prove that they're actually working and being effective, which can mean they put significant pressure on themselves. And again, with the lack of those water cooler moments, they feel they haven't necessarily got peer support. So making sure you're checking in with your staff and making sure that they have someone who isn't necessarily a manager that they can talk to get that peer support. Feelings of isolation, people may well not have families at home. You could have an employee who is remote working, not leaving the house, not really interacting with other people, and is just head down days every day, and it's not a particularly healthy working environment. So making sure that you're aware of what people's situations are, and making sure that you're checking in on people to make sure they're not becoming too isolated. And people who feel unable to access supervisors and just discuss concerns. So something I love about where I work, we've got an open door policy. I can walk into anybody's office, have a chat directly with my supervisor. I can discuss concerns with colleagues. That can be lost to an extent with remote working. So what you need to be careful of is that if employees are ringing you, even if it feels like the phone's ringing all the time, people want video time with you all the time, make sure that you are allowing people access to you as a supervisor and are able to discuss their concerns, which for you as a manager, that means that you need to be relying on your peer support as well, and that you're not becoming overwhelmed with that. Think about a limit on head down days. So by a head down day, for me as a solicitor, what that often means is, if I've got some significant drafting to do, I might be working on new contracts, I might be preparing witness statements or submissions or something like that. A head down day is exactly that. Very little contact with emails, it's head down and work. And it might mean, the out of office is on, the phone's on divert going to voicemail so that I can get my head down and work. Now, I would suggest, particularly with remote working, that they have a limit on head down days, purely because people aren't getting that interaction with their staff members, and you don't want it to become a habit that they're cutting themselves off from the rest of the company and feeling the pressure to get work done in that way. So head down days should be limited to, where there's either a significant piece of work that needs a real effort on a specific day, or something that's got particular urgency, or perhaps something that's very academic and that requires some peace and quiet and someone to cut themselves off. But having a limit on those days is something that we would definitely recommend. Have a facility for people to ask for support. So opening those channels and saying, if somebody needs support, if they need help, this is the person that you go to, and making sure that channel is clear. And also making it clear that requests for support will be dealt with confidentially. Make sure you diarise team meetings, one-to-ones, and social calls. So making sure that, in a busy work environment, that those social calls aren't dropping off, your one-to-ones aren't dropping off, that you're still getting that time with all your team members as well as the team meetings. Consider social media connect mechanisms. So as a firm, we use Workplace. Now that is purely for social elements, sharing training ideas, welfare ideas. People can have private groups. So for example, we have an employment group and a litigation group. There's a family group. So people within the teams can have a chat on a sort of social basis. And then we also have a welfare group where we share welfare ideas, videos on YouTube, recipes, things like that. And then also a training group. So at the moment, there's lots of free training out there that people can do online, particularly if they're on furlough, working from home. So making sure people are aware of the types of training that are out there if they want to do something to expand their skills base. So we found Workplace really good. It's a free resource. We haven't gone for the premium just because we find that the free one is fantastic, and it's felt like a really good way of connecting all of our staff members as well. Make sure staff have private forums to connect. So if you do monitor emails, staff may well feel that they're not able to open up with other staff members. So make sure that they have the facility if they want to have private video calls with their colleagues, and also the private groups like you can have on Workplace as well. Make sure you're sharing the team's achievements. So if your team has achieved something, if you've reached a certain goal, a certain sales revenue, or a large piece of work has been completed, there's maybe industry recognition, or you've won a pitch, make sure the team's achievements are shared, and make sure you're thanking everyone in the team as well, so that they feel part of that achievement. Because the reality is, had you been in an office, you might have all congregated in the canteen and congratulated each other. Make sure you're not missing out on those moments just because you're working remotely. Make sure individual achievements are shared as well. So if someone does something particularly well, something particularly impressive, make sure that that is shared with the wider team as well. Global goal updates. So if someone's working from home, they can feel very much focused on what they're doing and perhaps what their team goals are. But if they're not physically in the workplace, they can sometimes lose sight of what the global goals of the business are. So make sure that they are aware of, look, this is where the business is going, this is what we're all working for together as a team, and make sure that they know that their contribution is valued towards that global goal. Remember, you're losing out on body language and tone when you're speaking with people on videos as well. So watch for issues carefully. If someone's behaving a little bit strange, or you think actually something just doesn't seem quite right, make sure that you're scheduling a private video call or a private call just to touch base with people. I would not underestimate the value of things like body language and vocal tone, and things that you will naturally pick up on in an office environment. And that's something that's very much lost in a remote environment. So make sure that you are checking in on your staff and if you've noticed something a bit unusual, either ask a colleague to check in on someone or have that chat yourself. One thing we are seeing is that whilst employees are less likely to call in sick, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're very well at home. So if someone has got the flu or something like that, they think, well, actually I can log on, I can just sort of get through the day, because they're not having to drive into work, because they're not seeing people face to face, they're more likely to struggle through a day if they're working from home. So again, making it very clear that if people aren't well, that they do need to take a sick day and take that appropriate rest, so they're not under too much pressure, and there's no longer term risks to employees who don't call in sick. So keeping your team together, social elements. So some ideas that we've seen with some of our clients, and some things that we've actually done as a firm. So pick a non-work related team goal for people to work towards. So if you're in your office, you may well have charity events that you do, things that people do as a team that aren't work related. So have a think about what you can do remotely to help bring people together in a social element, rather than bringing people together just in a purely work context. So for example, you could send all your staff pedometers and have team steps. So how many steps, if you can get to 1 million steps, for example, between your team within a month, perhaps the company will donate a bit of money to charity, or you could even raise some money online as well. And it's a great way of also encouraging your staff to make sure they're getting out, getting some exercise, and not just in the house. If you don't want the expense of sending out pedometers, I think you can pick them up for a couple of quid. People's phones these days, most of them have got step trackers on them as well. Have a think about virtual charity events. So I've seen businesses doing virtual races. So rather than having the ability to take clients or staff to things like the races or charity events, they're actually doing them online. So they're dressing up. People are able to drink. They'll be in the evening. And the events are actually held remotely. And think about quiz evenings as well. These are a great way of getting your staff to interact. It's a good way of having a bit of fun as well. So as a firm, we're doing them weekly, and a prize is actually sent out as well and delivered to whoever's won. It's delivered to their home. Share wellbeing information. Make sure you arrange group training with time built in to debrief together afterwards. So if you have a wellbeing session together, that could be about how to keep yourself well at home, how to manage your work-life balance, or it could be training on a specific issue. I would always say to make sure that at the end of the session you have that time, either where the course leader has gone, or it's just you as a team and you can talk about, you know, what you got from the session, what people might want from future sessions, and have that team brief in the same way that you would do at the end of a session if you were there physically. Often as people are walking out the room, they're all having a bit of a chat about it. So making sure you're not losing that element. Make time for social and wellbeing one-to-ones. We've already touched on that. Embrace video calling. The more you do of it, the less awkward it gets, and the more it starts to feel normal. Headsets and earphones. So I really advocate headsets and earphones. They can help people feel more connected. You get better sound quality and there's less background issues, and you can actually pick up some you know, reasonable quality ones for quite a reasonable price as well. And it can help people feel more connected to what they're doing on the screen as well, if the background noise is sort of cancelled out. Etiquette. Ensure no one's left out and consistently overspoken on video calls. So if there's going to be an order in which you're going to speak, like Zoom's particularly good because whoever's speaking, the box comes up in the middle. And there's other programs where you can put your hand up as well to speak. So making sure that there is an etiquette. What you don't want is if you've got the loudest team members that are consistently contributing and people are getting spoken over, is that you end up with someone sort of sitting back on a video call, not saying a huge amount, getting overlooked and feeling quite left out. So making sure that everybody speaks on a call, even if it's just to check in and say yes, everything in their department or their area is fine, but just monitoring to make sure that you haven't got someone sort of sitting there quietly in the background and feeling a bit left out. So final points, there's lots to consider and manage. Don't hesitate to take advice, and don't be afraid to review and change the arrangements you've got in place. These days, I would say that the way of working is going to move very quickly. You're not always going to get warning that the way of working is going to change. So don't be afraid to actually say, this isn't working, we need to review this and we need to look at some different changes. In terms of what's coming next, you know, with people coming back into the workplace, whether we're going to be able to have as many people in offices, risk assessments need to be undertaken. You know, there's lots of physical challenges that need to be overcome. People could be working from home or rotating from being in the office and working from home for many months to come. So don't be afraid to review and make those changes so that in the longer term, you're working from home environment and your staff are productive and working well. So that is the end of the content for today. Just to make you aware, for DVSC members, we have got 4 months free support with HR Anchor, which includes legal advice from Gamlen's Law as and when you need it in relation to employee issues. We also undertake HR outsourcing. As I said, we do full legal support, and we don't have insurance restrictions either with our offering. And we're very much about your workforce, your way. So if you do need any assistance, please don't hesitate to let us know. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Some questions have popped up. So I'm just going to address a couple of those. And then if anybody has any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact me afterwards. We also have a mailing list for updates that we send out as well. So if you want to get employment law updates or updates about the coronavirus crisis and HR and things like that, please don't hesitate to drop me an email and you can come on our mailing list. If you don't want to be on the mailing list, but you still want to get the content, we do have a new resources website, which is www.gamlenshub.com. So please don't hesitate to check that out because it's got all of our content on there as well. So first question, so we've got employees working from home. If we think somebody isn't working from home properly, can we undertake disciplinary proceedings on a remote basis? So yes, thanks for the question. Great question. You can undertake usual procedures on a remote basis. You just need to make sure that the employee has the opportunity to engage properly in those processes. Now that might mean adding an extra couple of steps to that process. It might mean a bit more administration, but ultimately you can undertake disciplinary processes remotely. Now what I would say is if remote working is something that's quite new, if you think it's just that somebody's struggling perhaps with work-life balance, they're getting a bit overwhelmed at home, have a look first to see if it's a welfare issue before launching into a disciplinary proceeding. But ultimately, yes, it can be done. Make sure that somebody can still access their companion if they choose to have one. So perhaps having a private room or a breakout room on a video call, so that that person can listen in as well and that they can discuss privately. So there's lots of mechanisms of doing that and lots of programs that make it available. Making sure as well that people haven't got a technological barrier. So if they can't get onto the program, if they can't access it for whatever reason, or they're struggling with with the video calls, you may well need to think of another way of holding things, or even having a look at a socially distanced disciplinary if all else fails. You need to make sure as well that obviously all evidence and things like that are properly circulated and people have good access to that they can review things properly as well before the disciplinary hearing. So there's nothing that impacts the fairness of that. Next question. So in terms of bringing people back from remote working into the office, is there a required notice we need to give? Okay, so no, another great question. So technically, if you've got somebody working from home, there isn't any formal notice that you need to give in order to bring them back in. What we would say is just make sure it's reasonable and fair. So don't ring somebody up at 10 to 9 on a Monday morning and say we need you in the office by 9 o'clock. That's it, you're back working in the office from now. I would say, give them a couple of days to sort themselves out at home, particularly if they may have childcare issues or other issues at home that they need to get straight before they can come back into the office. If there is something urgent, you're absolutely entitled to try and call people back in, but what we're saying is, there's been a big adjustment here. People have been working from home for a long time. You may well need to start looking at phased returns and things like that. So for example, myself, I've been working from home now for 11 or 12 weeks. It's a quarter of the year. It's a long time to be working from home, and that sudden change and that sudden shift into a different working pattern could well affect people mentally. It can affect their welfare. So make sure you've considered in advance actually how you want to bring people back, and make sure you've done it in a measured and fair way. Employees have got concerns about the safety of the workplace coming back. Okay, so this is something that we're going to be addressing in another one of our sessions. So we're going to be having a chat about risk assessments and things like that. But if you've required an employee to come back, if they're saying they're refusing to come back because the workplace isn't safe, review your safety arrangements, make sure that actually they don't have a point, make sure the workplace is safe. If you're satisfied that it is, that you've undertaken your risk assessment and taken all the measures that you need to take, you then, what I would say is reassure, warn, and then take action. So if you've reassured them and they still won't come in, if you've warned them and they still won't come in, perhaps then is the time to potentially take disciplinary action for them not following a management instruction if they're refusing to come to work, or they could end up on unpaid leave. Because if you've called them into work, say if you've brought them either back from furlough, or you're ending the remote working, you need them to come back in and they won't do it, then potentially it's either unpaid leave or ultimately a disciplinary process. So that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for your engagement and the questions. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you ever so much to Denbighshire Voluntary Services Council for hosting this session, and we're looking forward to the next 3 sessions over the next 3 weeks. Thank you very much.